All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here this morning on our fourth Impact Safety Call. Good morning and Merry Christmas, by the way. Thank you for taking some time out in this busy season to join us. I want to welcome everyone. We're very excited for today's topic, and our guest speaker. Today's topic is crane assembly, disassembly, director responsibilities. A lot of information is going to be shared today, and our guest speaker is Mr. Bill Smith. I will introduce him shortly. I want to just mention a few things for this coming year. We got 4 dates coming up for our webinars, February 26th, May 27, August 26th, and December 2nd, all Wednesdays. We're going to have some really good topics coming up. Some of our topics include Subpart R, controlling contractor language. We're going to have, sorry, someone jumped in the video there. Anti-harassment initiatives, silicon fumes, heat stroke, fall protection, changes to boom and scissor lift rules, and some other topics. So we're really excited about this coming year, and I hope everyone's able to attend on all of those. Again, today's topic, something that's really high profile in industry right now is cranes. Pretty much every job site in the country has some type of a crane on it. We're using them every day. So I want to introduce Mr. Smith. Bill Smith is with us this morning. He's a Vice President of National Builders Insurance Services. His responsibilities there include claim and risk management, loss prevention, safety awareness, and accident investigation. Previously, he's worked as a safety and health specialist as Directorate of Construction for the U.S. Department of Labor and OSHA. He started his career as an apprentice crane operator in Baltimore, Maryland. He's worked as a journeyman and heavy equipment operator in the field. He also has worked as a business agent and lobbyist with the Baltimore Building and Construction Trades Council. Later after that, he served as the Director of Safety and Training for the International Union of Operating Engineers in Washington, D.C. In his time, he's also served as a corporate safety and labor relations manager with Maximum Crane, one of the largest crane rental companies in the country. Since then, he's also served as a member of the ASME B30 Safety Council Standard for Cranes. In addition, he's a National Commission for the Certification of Crane Operators, National Safety Council A10 Committee for Construction Standards. He's also served on the Steel Erection Negotiated Rules Submaking Committee for Subpart R as well as Subpart N. So he certainly has a long resume, an expert in the field. And Bill, we look forward to this presentation. And thank you for your time. And with that, I don't see you yet on if you can turn your video on, that'd be great.
Yeah, I have it on, Pete.
Ah, there you are. Great. So glad to have you here with us, and the floor is yours.
Pete, thank you. And thanks everyone else for taking the time out of their busy day around the holidays, especially. I'm going to share my presentation with everyone right now. Hopefully it'll come up on the screen. Yep. Let's go to the beginning. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through the rules of assembly and disassembly according to the federal law, FedOSHA. And what are the responsibilities? In addition, I'm also going to talk about the lift director responsibilities in the end of this presentation as it relates to B30.5. And the reason being is they're so closely related together, sometimes they simply overlap. But we'll get started today. Now, why do we have regulations? Hopefully everybody can see this video. Turn your volume up. But things happen in the workplace. And when things happen in the workplace, the government then regulates what occurs to provide a safe workplace for employers and employees to maneuver in. Thus, we have the new CDAC law, the new CC 1400 that includes the assembly and disassembly of cranes based on statistics.
Problems started almost from the beginning when the monument swung into electrical wires, but difficulties mounted. Take a look at this exclusive video of what happened next.
Well, I was guiding the stone down, and the stone began to move away from me, and I knew something was wrong, and I knew he was going to have to sit it down hard to stop it.
It was supposed to be a routine project, replacing a historic monument here at 3rd and Dock, and then it all came crashing down.
So I could tell you accidents like this occur. Now, having said that, that whole crew, unqualified riggers, unqualified lift directors, probably an uncertified and unqualified crane operator as well. But for them reasons, we get into the process of rulemaking. So we all know about the OSH Act in 1970, how it created the rules for cranes. Back then, they used an ASME B30.5 1968 version of industry standards. And that's why the B30.5 is still critical today with different volume and a different time. So let's look back a little bit. In 92, OSHA published an advance notice of rulemaking after the tower crane collapse in San Francisco. Then up until 2002, OSHA announced the use of negotiated rulemaking. I sat on that committee with CDAC with 23 members of us for 1 week a month for 11 months to create the new rule. Very similar to when we did Subpart R and SENRAC with the steel erection. In 03, 23 of us were picked. We finished our work in about a year from in 06. OSHA recommended, or ACOSH recommended, that our work be presented to the government. They proposed a rule in 2008, 2009, a public hearing, 2010, SABREFA does it. Operator certification was postponed in that rule for 7 more years. It was just completed April of 2019. So think about the government, how long it takes. In 1992, they give you an advance notice of the fact that they're going to change the rule for cranes. And until 2019, the final rule gets finished. So that's a heck of an advance notice for the industry to get prepared and to understand that there's going to be changes. That's just our government working at its best. And I may be critical, but I worked there for 3 years and I understand how critical I can be, which is why I'm not there anymore. Where to find the documents? For those that want to write it down, these are the websites to go actually to the rule and what assembly and disassembly pertains to, and what the federal law requires people that are putting cranes up, tearing cranes down, and the regulations they have to follow. Now, we created a brand new rule, 1926-1400, and we know that 1926 is a construction industry standard. 1910 rules deal with general industry, so the crane rules are different. So if you have a crane in a general industry setting, you'll fall under 1910. If you have a crane in a construction setting, you'll fall under 1926. So the rules are definitely different, although a duck is a duck and a crane is a crane. Depending on where it's at, you will be under a different set of rules and regulations according to the federal government. Today, we're only going to talk about a couple things. We're going to talk about ground conditions, assembly and disassembly. You see them highlighted in the red. You can see this rule goes from 1400, which is the scope, up to, on this slide, 1416, but it continues. The rule actually goes down to 1442. So there's 42 sections of a new rule that used to be a couple pages long because the government decided to delineate across the rule responsibilities for different parties. And we'll get into that right now. We're not going to talk about all of these. I just wanted to mention that there's a lot of information in the new rule that if you have never seen it, you probably should at least go through it because it pertains to working around cranes, both operators and eye workers in most cases together. Now for the scope, It applies to power operated equipment when used in construction to hoist, lower, and horizontally move a suspended load. These are all ideas and information as to what a crane could be. But think about how broad, just think about how broad for a minute that scope really is. Power operated equipment that can raise up, hoist, lower down, and horizontally move a suspended load. If you fall in that type of operation, you fall into this new crane standard. Having said that, there are exclusions. The one that deals with most of us in this is powered industrial trucks, which we know them to be forklifts, except when they're configured to hoist or lower by means of a winch or a hook, and then horizontally move a suspended load. So there's a lot of equipment out there that'll fall into and a lull type equipment that can raise and lower the load and might have a hook or a winch attached to the end as a attachment that you can purchase. You bring that piece of equipment from a RT type, forklift type model into the crane standard because of the attachments that you may put on the end of it. Now at the end, it covers attachments may change, which changes the rule, like delivery and construction. So here's a great example. If you have a boom truck that has a flatbed and you're hauling product and you arrive at the job site and you just unload it with that boom truck and you drop it off, and then that's all you do, that's a delivery operation. So the crane operators and individuals aren't required. But if you're delivering that into the 7-story window and you're using sheetrock and you have an attachment that picks it up from being flat and raises it vertically and then sends it into the window, that is still considered delivery. It's when you use that crane to move things around after you deliver your product that you fall into the standard. So let's remember that. Now, qualified rigger. Employers must use a qualified rigger for rigging operations during assembly and disassembly. That's pretty much standard. Qualified riggers are used throughout the document. State plans may be a little bit different. Now, I'm going to bring you up New York City. So what's happening in New York? And the other reason I bring this up is because this is where they go back and forth between an assembly, disassembly individual and a lift director individual. So the New York City Building Department put out some rules effective May 24th of 2017. The rule mandates that a lift director be present at a construction site while a crane or derrick is performing certain tasks and identifies responsibilities of the lift director. Now, I'm not reading the rest of it, but if you go down, lift director is required when the crane or derrick is picking a load, when it's traveling, when it's being placed in the park position, taken out of service. But it goes on to an exception. Here's where it goes back and forth. And I wanted to make sure that everybody's aware that state plan states, and I'll use Seattle now with their labor and industry department are making changes to the crane rules as we present this and as we speak. And we don't know how that's going to look, but here's an exception under New York. It says the requirement for a lift director does not apply to the assembly or disassembly of a crane or derrick, nor to the use of an assist crane or derrick during assembly and disassembly. And that one word in there says provided an assembly disassembly director is supervising the operation in accordance with the rules promulgated by the commissioner. So basically what it's saying is you are either an assembly disassembly director in that type of operation, putting them together, tearing them apart, or you may be a lift director if you're not that person. It's a play on words, but it basically means that they both go hand in hand because a lift director directs any lift, including boom parts, counterweight parts. Anytime a crane is used, like an assist crane to lift something, it's still defined as a lift. So you just have to pay attention. And here's why, right? We have to get into it. I wanted to make sure we understood that the final rule does not require either riggers or signal people to be certified, but it does require them to be qualified. And the qualification, as it always has been in the government, is by a recognized degree, certificate of professional standing, or knowledge, training, and experience. Most of our companies give the knowledge, training, and experience to say that someone is qualified. We do it through the labor union with some training. We do it through the industry with on-the-job training. ANSI, American National Standards Institute, does have an A10.42 volume, and that volume is the qualification of riggers. So if you've never seen ANSI A1042, you probably should if you have a bunch of riggers on your staff. Now on the signal person, they just have to be qualified, but they have to be evaluated, they have to understand through training, and then they have to be tested, both in a practical setting and a written setting. So the new rule does call for signal people to be tested by practical means and by written means, and some successful completion be presented, which is similar to being certified. However, it's done in-house or through the labor union or through your company, and is not done by an external party, meeting different standards. Now, ground conditions under 1402. This is where it starts to get into the assembly and the disassembly portion. And I'm not giving you an opinion in any way. I'm just presenting the facts the way they're written. And everyone has to decide where they fit into the facts regardless. But the rule basically says under B, the equipment must not be assembled or used unless ground conditions are firm, drained, graded to a sufficient extent so that in conjunction with the supporting materials, basically it stands up, right? It doesn't fall over. I have highlighted here subpart with question mark. This is the same exact language, basically, that was taken out of subpart R. And the committee felt as though if subpart R promulgated the rule with that language in it for the ground conditions to be firm, drained, and graded to the extent that they support the crane and its load, then we just move that over to subpart N, or the new CC 1400, which replaced subpart N. And the reason being is because don't reinvent the wheel, you already have it. Now, the controlling entity must ensure that the paragraph under just above it, a B, is met, that the ground is what it is, and they have to inform the user of the equipment and the operator about any hazards unknown, voids, tanks, utilities, drawings, any soil analysis that are taken. That's the responsibility of the controlling entity. Now here's the challenge. Who is that? So if there is no controlling entity, the paragraph C1, right, to fit B, it just says any employer that has the authority at the site to make arrange for ground preparations needed to meet that. So if the assembly, disassembly director, or the operator determines that the ground does not meet the requirements of B, that person's employer must have a discussion with the controlling entity regarding the ground. So whoever's putting the crane together, if it's a complete crane company, do it themselves, or if it's in combination between a crane rental company and an ironworker company working hand in hand, and they determine that the ground doesn't meet what they need to have a conversation with who can change that ground conditions. Now that's what the rule says. And so it's putting a policy in place that must be understood and presented, right? Ground conditions gone bad. Here's why ground conditions are so critical around cranes. This is not assembly and disassembly, but we've had assembly and disassembly cranes go over for ground condition and stability issues, even though someone felt as though or thought that the ground was capable of supporting with all of the mats that they placed down, but you can see what happens. So you can see things can go to hell in a handbasket pretty quickly. Hopefully everybody can see that video and hear it clearly. But are you an assembly disassembly or are you a lift director in this case? So for the assembly and disassembly of cranes, you got two options. You follow what the manufacturer says that you do, or you invent, you create, you determine your own employer procedures. And a lot of times the manufacturer procedures are pristine, right? It's perfect conditions, it's laid out flat, their own concrete in the manuals, whatever. In our world, the world we live in, chances are it's not perfect. You will use assist cranes because you can't get everything into it. You'll put it together off the back of a tractor trailer, which no manufacturer has that as a procedure. So theoretically, you are developing your own employer procedures. So the AD director is an individual that meets the subpart irrespective of his job title or his position. It is basically a function, and someone in that crew will take that title as assembly and disassembly director just by their function. So you have to remember who that is. Their job is 1, 2, and 3. Prevent unintended dangerous movement and prevent collapses of any part of the equipment. Provide support and stability for all parts. And then position employees during the assembly to limit their exposure so that no one gets killed or hurt. And the employer procedures must be developed by a qualified person. We're probably lacking in that in many cases on many jobs, because we've been doing this forever and we don't have what we consider procedures developed by a qualified person in writing. But why do we do this? So here's 3 different issues, right? The first one is a man dying when they were disassembling a lattice boom crane. The second one, terribly, they drove the wrong pins without having the equipment supported. You can see from that picture, as gross as it may be, the maul still in his glove and hand, and how the boom came down on top of it. And the third one is a 37-year-old Hispanic man that was killed. So they continue to occur as we speak. The AD supervisor is both competent and qualified. We know what the difference is, right? Qualified, we talked about knowledge, training, and experience. To be qualified, competent means you have the authority by your company to make a change, to make a difference, and to understand that you have the authority to get things done. The AD supervisor understands the assembly and disassembly procedures, reviews the procedures, unless they've done it over and over again, and they can prove that. And then the crew members must understand their task. That's where we probably fail a little bit in getting the crew together to go over a JSA before assembly and disassembly, and then try to, as best as we can, have that documented. So you have to follow the manufacturer's prohibitions, pins, outriggers, sections, whether the outriggers are either fully deployed or not, because if they're not, you swing the counterweights around, you can turn them over. Now, a lot of this is both the operator and the assembly, disassembly director working hand in hand. And I talk about pins because pins are a major part. The work is done by a qualified rigger, and slings that are used are protected because we have them constantly failing. Here's an example of deviating from the manufacturer. And when you do, what happens is you use other rigging, and if you don't have the proper rigging and it fails, catastrophic events occurs. This is one that actually we insured up in New York on a bear rental project. 7 people died in this incident. You can see what they did was they deviated from the manufacturer. The manufacturer called for 8 chain falls to be used to hold the collars, and instead 4 slings were used. The 4 slings were not protected, and the result was the slings ripped and broke and were cut. They were hanging on the end of chain falls because the chain falls were used to jack the collar up and lower the collar to get it into position, but they had wrapped the slings around the edges of the steel, therefore they cut them, and they used 4 slings instead of 8 chain falls to hold everything in place. You can see the collars landed at the bottom. This is a picture, the building all the way in the far where the orange barricades are around the building, the nets, the safety lines. That's where this crane started. The building right behind it, it fell into. The alleyway in the middle, it fell below. And then I just want to point out that roof that you see where the two individuals are standing on top of, that's where the tie-in member was thrown, like you would cast a fishing rod, from that building all the way at the other side that had the orange barriers. It was thrown from there in the air because they were connected to it, and it landed in the roof of this building. You can see right in the middle of the black area, basically a hole there and debris. That's where the beam went through that top of that building and went 4 stories down into the basement and embedded itself into the foundation. But that's how catastrophic it can be for assembly and disassembly. That's where it leaned across to the first building, hit that wall there, broke in half. When it did, it flipped upside down. It landed in that alleyway and crushed the 3-story building down to what you see as rubble. This is some of the debris afterwards. It kind of looks a little nowhere near severe, but looks a little like New York when they had the 9/11 problem going on with towers and how disruptive and catastrophic that was. But you can see one incident alone, rigging, assembly of a crane and jacking it up causes this much turmoil and this much event to occur with the 7 fatalities.
So, Bill, I want to interrupt quick. We have a question, and I think we probably have somewhat answered it, but I want to get it answered. It says, what is the definition of a lift director? Is there a defined definition per OSHA or ANSI that spells that out?
Yeah, so right now I'm doing assembly disassembly director as the federal rule requires. In a couple minutes, I'm going to run into the lift director as the B30 requires, and you'll have both of them by definition and roles and responsibilities.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
Yep. All I did here was talk about tower crane accidents, results of statistics from before. Erection and dismantling or extending, climbing the crane was the highest when it came to tower cranes and accidents. That was one example of extending or climbing the crane. You can see in this, the purple area was the largest in results of 54 accidents, 20 being in assembly and disassembly, and then the others around it. Having said that, here's the one that's most recent that we can't talk about, but I think it's relative to the assembly or the disassembly of a crane, and many of us have already seen this video.
Seattle's mayor says it's a miracle that a mother and her baby girl survived a deadly crane collapse. Dramatic dash cam video shows the moment that the crane came crashing down at Google's new campus in Seattle on Saturday. 4 people were killed, including college student Sarah Wong and iron worker Travis Corbett. 4 others were hurt. The 25-year-old mother and her 4-month-old daughter made it out of this car. In Seattle's.
So having said that, the challenges and the impact and just the responsibility alone of making sure that you're either following the manufacturer procedures or if you've created your own, that you're doing everything right, because we're all human beings. And as human beings, we do sometimes make mistakes, or we're pressured into doing it quickly, or we just cut a corner ourselves just to get it done. So FedOSHA has what we're talking about today. They have cranes and derricks in construction under 1400 and 1442. They also had subpart R steel erection. The 753 section, hoisting and rigging, deals with what we're talking about. Subpart H is material handling, storage, use, and disposal. And in point 251, rigging equipment for material handling is in there. ASME, we'll talk about now in a minute. They have standards of care for the crane industry, and they deal with tower cranes under 0.3, mobile cranes under 0.5. Every one of us use slings, so there's a standard of care for slings, 0.9, 0.10 are hooks, 0.26 is rigging, and 0.29 are self-erectors. Now, if you've never seen these standards of ASME, especially under tower cranes and mobile cranes, and then slings and hooks and rigging hardware, that's what we use every day in the industry that we're all in, cranes and rigging. And if you have never seen them, you should, because they have a lot of requirements in there for individuals and how to care for them, how to design them, construct them, how to use them, how to inspect them. So that's what's needed. Now, I'll provide this to Impact and to the group NBIS, my company, we just put a checklist together for assembly and disassembly of tower cranes, including OSHA that we just talked about and ANSI requirements that I'm going to talk about. And all we did was pull them all together. This is a good checklist for your JSA when your AD director has to get the crew together to talk about what we got to look out for, what we got to take care of, pinch points, things that come up. We did the same thing for mobile cranes. So these are provided through us. We'll give them to the group. You guys can amend them, use them, change them, throw them away. It's just informational issues. The reason we did that is because under Assembly and Disassembly Director in OSHA, there are 12 key hazards that you have to go over with your crew. They are in that list, plus a few others from the standards of care. So you can see this is 1 through 6. 5 is the stability for pin removal. That was that one picture I showed you where they removed the pins and they weren't stable. The tower crane that just fell, the video, was about pins either in or out during the disassembly and the stability of that crane with the pin in or out before you actually take the pins out. So that is a critical element. These are the other up to the 12 that you have to pay attention to as an assembly and disassembly director. Here it says synthetic slings. It basically says you can use them as long as they're not prohibited, but if you use them, you have to use them according to the manufacturer, and they have to be equal to or greater than what the manufacturer requires you to use. That was the issue with the 8 chain falls that were required to be used, and the 4 slings that were used instead. They did not only meet the manufacturer's requirements to be equal to or greater than, but they were used in the wrong way, which caused that incident to occur. Now there's a fall protection requirement out there. 6 feet is across the board for any non-assembly, disassembly work according to the government. And we know there's different levels of fall protection depending what you do. Subpart R has their own. But in this CC 1400, the committee decided on horizontal lattice booms where the fall distance is 15 feet or less, you don't have to have fall protection, but once it's above 15 feet, you do. We kind of modeled the subpart R where they allowed the 15-foot rule and then the 30-foot rule, but we kind of modeled it saying, look, there's nothing to tie off to when you're on the top of a boom putting it together because there's no pennant line stretched out, there's nothing in the air, and you'd have to either do it by a JLG type operation or you'd have to tie off at your feet, which causes a tripping hazard, and by the time your lanyard pulled out, you'd hit the ground. The only other exclusion is when employees are near the draw works. We've had people that tie off around the draw works and suck themselves right into the, to the boom drums or the hoist drums. So we allowed an exception there. This is just a fact sheet that's out there that everybody should see. You can get it on the OSHA website. It covers pretty much what I've just said and talked about during assembly and disassembly. We'll move into, unless everybody has a question, I'm going to move right now into the ANSI standard as it pertains to lift director that is involved in the assembly and disassembly of a crane. So what happened was the standard is the 1400 standard we just talked about. And this standard, the B30 standards, are also used in general industry across the board and or civil court in tort law. Now, the reason I say it's general industry is because the 1400 is just construction. And I started out the presentation by saying we have a construction standard and then we have a general industry standard that is different. In 1910, none of that applies. It's the old rule. In construction, it did. Now, in this B30, it applies across the board. It does not have boundaries. So that's why we're going to talk about the lift director responsibilities here. We all know in an accident, it's always an argument of he said, or he said, she said. Remember I told you in the old rule in 1968, OSHA in 1970 adopted the 1968 version of the crane standard that existed. Well, this is when it started. Back in 1924, believe it or not, they started the B30 committee. And then when they got to 0.5, which is the 5th volume, and there's 30 volumes currently, but when they got to the 0.5 volume, the 5th volume, they created the rule here in 1962 for what the rule should be working around a crane. OSHA adopted that. Now, that has changed. And that's why it's important for us to understand the changes. So it took about 10 years to get the 2007 version to come out with delineated responsibilities. Now think about that for a minute. I'm going to talk to you about lift director and site supervisor and rigor responsibilities that are in everything we do. And this volume changed it currently now 12 years ago. And many of us probably on the call don't even know they exist. It used to be law firms were the major purchaser of these standards to the tune of 85% of the sales went to law firms. Why did they do that? Because they were using the standards against all of our companies, our employers, and our operators and our workers. So we changed the volume because the wording was wrong prior to 07. It said a bunch of things. The latest volume that's out now is ASME B30.5 2018 version. If you don't have it, you should have it in this industry. You need to take a look at it. Here's why. The responsibilities now have been delineated. A single individual may be one or more of these roles. So we have defined a crane owner, a crane user, a site supervisor, a lift director, and a crane operator. Someone asked the question about lift director. A lift director is an individual that directly oversees the work being performed by a crane and the associated rigging crew. I'll go in a little bit deeper as to what that means. A site supervisor is like the controlling entity. Remember we talked about the controlling entity and the ground conditions for the crane for assembly and disassembly? The site supervisor has that same responsibility as a controlling entity. They exercise the control over the work site on which a crane is being used and over the work which is being performed on that site. So the controlling entity falls in line with the site supervisor. The lift director kind of falls in line with the assembly and disassembly director, putting a crane together, tearing it apart, and also the lift director is going to be responsible while the crane is being operated. So let's go through a little bit, right? We've added rigor responsibilities. And the reason I have it in blue is because it is in the 2018 version of the volume. So the rigger now selects, configures, and assembles the rigging equipment for attachment, support, control, and detachment of the load during lifting activities. Lifting activities could also mean during assembly and disassembly when you're using a assist crane to lift parts of the crane to put another crane together. So a rigger has these functions. The responsibilities of the rigger now are at a minimum, and look at the words. We say shall. We don't use the word should as a recommendation anywhere throughout this document, right? We use the word shall all the way through the document. So the rigger responsibility is to ensure the weight of the load is approximate to the center of gravity, select the rigging equipment. Remember I told you B39, 10, 20, 23 is personnel lifting. You have to pay attention to the volumes that are in the B30s because it relates to everything we're doing. Ensuring that the rated loaded rigging and the selected configuration is sufficient. We talked about that. Attaching the equipment, ensuring that it's protected from abrasion or cutting, rigging the load to ensure balance and stability, knowing the signals for equipment use, and installing tag lines when additional load control is required. Going forward, we talk about the site supervisor and lift director, and in some situations, that may be so small that they are the same person. They control the site, and they also have lift directing responsibilities. Having said that, the site supervisor, lift director has to do two. See number 2, sufficient room to assemble and disassemble the crane in an operating area that is suitable for the crane with respect to levelness, surface conditions, support capability, proximity. This wording is very similar to the controlling entity wording about having firm, level, capable ground of supporting and surface conditions that support the crane and its load when it's assembled. Ensuring that the work involving assembly and disassembly of the crane is supervised by a qualified person. Wind, velocity, and gusting winds. We know wind was a part of that Seattle accident when it came to tearing that thing down. Because without that storm, it had probably stood tall and would have never fell over, but the storm had a major part in the fact of assembly and disassembly of that crane. Now, the lift director. somebody asked earlier, you know what the responsibility of lift director was as far as controlling the crew and overseeing the lift. Here's his responsibility shall include, not should include, but shall include ensuring that the preparation of the area needed to support the crane has been completed before the crane operations start. That's in their responsibility. Addressing safety concerns raised by anybody and being responsible if they decide to override their concern and direct crane operators to continue. They appoint the signal people. The signal person has to meet the requirements, and they allow crane operation near power lines only when you keep the distance. So that's the lift director's responsibility. The black is additional. I'm just trying to highlight for time some of the critical thing. Ensuring that a crane's load rigging is performed by designated personnel, ensuring the load is properly rigged and balanced before it is lifted more than a few inches. Crane operators, the operator is not responsible for hazards or conditions that are not under his direct control that adversely affect the lift, and lift operations are resumed only after safety concerns have been addressed or the continuation of the crane operator is directed by a lift director. So the crane operator responsibility has a lot of responsibilities in this list. Everything here on this page, everything here on this page is theirs. We don't operate the crane when it's physically or mentally unfit, not engage in any practice that divert our attention. Cell phones is a big problem in the world today, and we don't want operators, diverting their attention while being on the phone. That's why we put that in. Knowing and following the procedures specified by the manufacturer or approved by a qualified person for assembly, disassembly, setting up and reeving the crane, and considering all factors that might affect the crane capacity and informing the lift director. So we have a lot of responsibilities that are placed on all parties. OSHA presented the A assembly, disassembly rules and responsibilities and procedures. We went through that. B30 addresses a lift director and all their responsibilities. This is a short presentation. I cut it down for time because of what we're doing, but I wanted to make this available to everybody. But we should go to the 1400 standard if you haven't seen it, and at least go to the sections on assembly and disassembly that are outlined in a standard. And if you don't have a copy of A1042, Qualified Rigger, you should. And if you don't have or haven't seen copies of the ASME B30s in the 0.5 for mobile cranes and the 0.3 for tower cranes, you should probably make sure that you get your hands on them publications as well, because all three of them impact what we do as an industry. And the challenge ends up being is it's so hard to be in compliance, but when you're not in compliance and you have an accident, you're in a world of hurt, you're in a world of trouble. And the old statement of you either knew or should have known because that's what you do for a living falls into play, and it burns us every time. I'm going to close just quickly with this little video presentation, but at the top, what I tell everybody is understand the regulations and standards of your business, and don't ever get caught by surprise. No matter what business you're in, don't ever get caught by surprise.
But can I find this in Arlington? Oh, good grief, yes. Oh, boy. Let's see how long it is. Let's hold it out.
This guy is probably close to 5 feet. Texas rat snakes are going to be one of the largest snakes that you find in the Metroplex area. Get this thing off me, man. Get this thing off me, man. God dang. What is this thing jumping at me for, man? He likes you. Yeah, I can tell.
So I want to end with a little bit of humor on a very tough situation that we have to deal with every day. Is there any questions, Pete, that we have to follow up on?
So as of right now, nobody's typed in the questions. So I want to encourage people, boy, if you have questions, now's the time. On the bottom, there's a question and answer box where you can go ahead and ask questions, and even open it up to just crane questions in general, crane safety, any of that we might have. So yeah, let's give it a moment here and see if we get any that pop in.
Yeah, no, we've been going about 45 minutes. I wanted to try and keep it less than an hour. It's a lot of information to cover from both the regulatory side and the industry consensus side. You see this slide with my email address. Even if we don't do anything now, take my email address, and anytime, anywhere in the future that you might come across or need some information, or you have a question that pops up as to who's who, or you don't know for sure, just email me the question, let me know that we were on this presentation, this webinar together, so I know where you're coming from. And then I'll find you the answer, and I'll get you the rules, the regs, or the standards that exist to help support or give you an idea of what your position should be.
So with that, we now have 9 questions rolling in. First one, can I get a copy of the PowerPoint? And I can answer that. The PowerPoint is going to be available on the Impact website, along with a link to YouTube where you can rewatch the presentation, but we're going to make the PowerPoint available on the website. Looks like another one here from Richard asks, can you review the statement about adding a hook to a rough terrain forklift makes it a crane?
Yeah, so there's the standard calls what it calls for. It says that anytime you take what is called a forklift, and that's whether it's a vertical mast, basically, or whether it's an RT, a rough terrain type, and then you add on the end of that with an attachment, a hook and or a winch, because a lot of the attachments will have a hook and a winch. But once you do that, and there's not a true interpretation yet. I looked last night online to see if OSHA has published a final interpretation. So there's not a true interpretation, but the rules basically say when you change it from using it as a forklift machine with forks that go into either pallets or use it for its original intended purpose, and you modify it with attachments to allow it to hoist and lower and horizontally move a load by methods of a hook and or a cable-driven winch, then you're going to theoretically, and I say it theoretically because it's a wording, you're going to theoretically pull it into the crane standard. And I don't know, I know if you put a winch on it with a cable, you will. I think the gray area ends up being some hook hanging off. And I use it in this way, like a jib, where you might have an attachment you hook to that has basically a jib-looking feature with a hook hanging on the end of it. I think OSHA is intending to interpret that as a crane-type apparatus where you can lower the hook down, connect it to some rigging, a cable, a choker, and then raise it up in the air, and then you just horizontally move it around the job. Some of these RTs will swing themselves, swing the boom, because the tires will stay and the outriggers will stay, but they'll be able to rotate the upper hydraulic boom section, and they got a hook and a cable and everything else on the end of them. And that's what the government was thinking. But I haven't found an interpretation to make it black and white. So
Okay.
I can't give you a solid one other than the one that I know of from being on the committee.
All right, then we have a comment where Martin just thanks us for the presentation. Anonymous asks, I may have missed, but is there any specific way to prepare the pad area, or is a soil test sufficient?
So soil testing is the ultimate, right? That's where you're doing core samples, where you make sure that you know and you define the soil classification as either an A, B, or C type soil. And then in that, you can figure out what the compaction density is for the A, B, or C type. The crane manufacturer will tell us what the ground bearing pressure is needed and what the forces will be applied to the ground with full counterweight and or full radius. So you'll be able to work backwards from there. If you don't have full boom out and you don't have full counterweight, there's a calculation that can be used from the crane side. Now, having said that, that means that we're coming out with pads or matting, and we're just assuming that if it's no void or underground hazard and everything's right, we can understand a sandy position, Florida, or a clay type position in some parts, or a rocky position out there. And we'll set up outrigger pads as best we can. The challenge ends up being in a big crane and big lifts, it's usually always done. The smaller cranes and the smaller lifts is where the industry is having its struggle trying to figure out, as I move this crane around the job to make multiple picks, and I set the outriggers out, and I put down my matting, whether they're poly matting or they're oak matting or they're wood matting, or in some cases steel matting, is that appropriate and capable of supporting not knowing what's under the ground? And that's a challenge for all of us. The current burden right now is on the controlling entity by OSHA and the site supervisor by B30 and the lift director, because they usually control more the site than the crane company would control the site, and that's why they place that burden there. But core samples are the best. Outside of that, I don't know if there's any other way, unless it's through drawings or history where it'll show utility lines, tank lines, voids, hazards that may be underneath some vault or something that we're trying to set our crane up on that no one knows about above ground, but whoever controls the site should know about it.
Okay. David asks, will there be a certification for assembly, disassembly of cranes for the director, I would assume? Is there going to be a certification?
Right now, the government's not mandating by regulations that AD director be a certified individual. They are demanding that they be qualified. We all know the qualification is knowledge, training, and experience. The training part of it, and I think Steve Rank, in some of his programs, in fact, I've taught this in a longer version at his, where the training is documented. The requirements of training need to be documented to show that the one leg of a three-legged stool, knowledge of the industry and the hazard training that you get, and then experience that you get along the way, is what qualified right now assembly disassembly director needs. I don't see the government ever certifying. I do believe that there's an attempt with the CCO division that currently certifies not only crane operators, but a multitude of industries. Someone has asked if they would put together a certification program for assembly, disassembly directors and lift directors, but I haven't seen that yet. And I'm a commissioner with CCO, but I haven't seen that in full-blown presentation. So at this point, my answer is probably no, but the future is going to change for all of us, I'm sure.
All right. Eric asks, on tower crane assembly, should the owner of the crane, the renter of the crane, or the ironworker crew be the assembly director?
It all depends. So in a lot of cases, the crane owner that rents a crane may give the information to the third-party erecting company, and I use New York. New York has crews that go around to raise and lower tower cranes on the weekends, and they're third-party independents of the owner of the crane. Other states and other companies do it differently. Sometimes the crane owner is also operating a crane with a crane operator, and their whole crew will put them up, tear them down with their mechanics and their operators and their other assist cranes, and they have it all. Sometimes in our jurisdictions, the ironworkers take over the assembly and disassembly by contract and by jurisdiction, and the crane owner may have an operator there, but the operator works with the raising gang or the crew that's putting up, tearing it down. So they do have to work hand in hand. It doesn't go without saying that nobody is exempt from the responsibilities of making sure everybody puts them together and tears them apart with all the knowledge they need. But everybody's different. There's no set rule on who's totally responsible. I think they all play a part. And in the event of doing it successfully, it all works. And in the event of where it's unsuccessful, I think the parts will be shredded apart to see who failed or didn't perform what they should have done to do it properly and prevent either property damage or injury or, God forbid, fatalities.
All right. Next question. Joe asked, to what degree of changes to the crane configuration does the operator evaluation have to be updated?
So currently right now, there is a part of the CDEC document, the new certification of crane operators now require an evaluation part. And that wasn't there before to the extent that you had to be a qualified operator by knowledge, training, experience. Now the challenge ends up being is OSHA has put in the wording that you have to be evaluated based on your knowledge, training, experience, but it's got to be done every time the crane configuration is different and or capacities and other cranes change. Now, that's a problem for the crane operator industry because they got historically a lot of crane operators who have been running cranes forever. They are certified by CCO or others. The IUOE certifies them, and also there's a couple other companies, NACB and CIC. The challenge, though, is that with the new requirement, you got to be evaluated. So theoretically, you are an operator in training always until you are evaluated by your employer that you can run that crane in that capacity and that configuration. Now, they say you don't have to be reevaluated if you change as long as it's similar in nature. So you can move around by manufacturers of cranes that are similar, and as long as you've been evaluated in a certain type of configuration, you'd be fine. So I'll use an example. Main boom, you're evaluated, but when you put a luffer on, you should be reevaluated. But that don't mean every time you change configurations, you have to be reevaluated again. But if you never run the crane in the current configuration that it's in, you should make sure that there has been an evaluation done for at least that configuration. And if you change it drastically from its operating characteristics vis-a-vis putting on a luffing attachment where you've never run a luffer because your drum capacities all change, then you probably should be reevaluated. And once you do it one time, you should be good for all luffers. Hopefully that answers the question. It's vague. It's kind of vague right now because there's not enough citations and there's not enough information to determine what OSHA is really thinking until we start to challenge it, and then we get interpretations on it.
Okay. Levi asks, what is the title standard for tower cranes?
So assembly and disassembly and the 1400 cover tower and mobile cranes. However, the B30 standard has a B30.3, and B30.3 is a standard of care for tower cranes in construction, or tower crane erection, dismantling, operation, everything to deal with a tower type crane, whether it's a hammerhead type crane or not.
Okay. Next question, Dean, looks like he's from Canada, asked, do you know by which standard does this apply in Canada, if any?
No, Dean, I don't know because we just deal in the U.S. And I know Canadian have different rules both across the country and also provincially. You may have different standards of care for each province. So I really can't answer that question. I wish I could, but I basically deal with the U.S. States.
All right. Hope they can find that information up there. Donald asked where we can purchase the ANSI B30 standards. Do you know that? Where it can be purchased? Yeah.
So, and they're about $70 to $85 or $90 per volume, just so you know, price wise. But if you go to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, and that's what ASME stands for. So it's the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. On their website, you'll be able to see all the published documents, and you'll be able to type in under search ASME B30.5 and B30.3, 9 and 10 and everything else.
All right. Next one here, Rob asks, can you review the controlling entity responsibilities and how they cross over to the assembly director responsibilities?
So the controlling entity is not necessarily the assembly disassembly. So what happens is the government said there is a controlling entity on every job site that controls the job site as it relates to ground conditions. And that controlling entity must make sure that the ground conditions are prepared in accordance with the standard to support the crane while putting it together and tearing it apart. B30 calls that entity a site supervisor. Now, the difference is that it said where there is no controlling entity by title, and I use that as a construction manager or a general contractor or someone in our world that would control the whole site, the site supervisor and the controlling entity. That's who they are. However, it does say that if there's no controlling entity that exists, the assembly disassembly director, whoever's putting the crane together, and the operator together must go to whatever party has the power to make the ground conditions adequate and capable of supporting. And I think they mean an owner of a property if no one else is there. Or if it's an ironworker company that's hired to do an ironworker job and he is the highest level employer, then by default, if he's the highest level employer on that job, on a small job, he becomes the controlling entity or site supervisor and must work with whoever owns the property to get the ground conditions capable to support the crane.
All right. Looks like our next question from Paul. When using a third-party assembly director, not exactly sure where he goes from there, but it says, does an ironworker have to be? I don't know if he's assuming, does it have to be an ironworker in that role or at least responsible?
No, the way it's designed is it's a function. So it doesn't have to be an ironworker or an operator. Whoever controls the gang, whoever is in charge of 1, 2, 3, 4 employees that are putting this crane together, and that person is in charge of directing them people, and they've had a preliminary meeting. Remember I told you the list that you can look at to go by? But you've had your JSA type meeting, you got your crew together, you want these guys to go to the end to pull the cable, you want these people to go to the other side to work on the counterweights and or anything else. That person by default, that function that he has, becomes the assembly disassembly director. It could be a complete crane crew with all the crane company and a master mechanic that's there. It could be an ironworker crew that's putting it together. There's one operator inside the crane, but he's not controlling the work crew. So the AD guy would be whoever the foreman might be or whoever's in charge of that 3, 4, or 5 people that are putting that big crane together. So it's a function more than a person by trade. It's whoever does it takes the title by default.
All right. Next question pertains, going back to the fork truck conversation. Where is it located in OSHA that relates to these attachments that you mentioned?
In that CC 1400 volume, throughout that volume, you can word search it on forklifts. It's right behind the scope, and it's in the exclusions that are right behind the scope of what 1400 is. So it's going to be under CC 1400 scope, and right behind the scope that says this is what it includes, the very next page, it'll talk about what it excludes. And it'll exclude forklifts except when, and that wording that I showed you was the exact wording from the regulation.
Okay. Next question, how can an ironworker better assist assembly or crane operators to avoid some of these accidents in the workplace?
I think it's what I said before, is that they both have to have a meeting of the minds. The assembly, disassembly director, foreman, whoever's in charge of the crew to put a crane together to tear it apart, got to meet with the operator, make sure that they understand the manufacturer procedures of putting them together, tearing them apart. If there's anything that stands out, either from the operator's perspective or from an AD guy that's done it before, they just have to make sure that they work hand in hand to look at any prohibitions that might exist from the manufacturer, make sure that everybody talks about shoring and supporting any parts of the crane before anything is taken apart or pins are pulled. And it's just a coordination thing. Even if they got to get the manual out, the operator's manual or the owner's manual that talks about how to put them together, tear them apart to make sure they don't miss anything. The operator should be technical in nature from the standard of the manual, and they should communicate together so that if the operator tells the assembly, disassembly director what to do first, second, or third, it doesn't get changed by someone else. It's a challenge that they both have to be partners. And that's really what it boils down to.
All right. Next, how do the new regulatory requirements in the ASME interact with the lift director requirements to ensure that the load is properly rigged and balanced?
So ASME, an industry consensus standard, and it's like I told you how long it's been around. There's 30 subcommittees of volunteer people. There's 48 main committee members. They vote on this to get it to an ANSI published document, American National Standards Institute. The qualifications of the rigger exist. The rigger and or lift director got to make sure that whenever they rig a load, it's capable of supporting, that everything is protected from tearing and ripping, and that the load is balanced before lifted. That's always been there. It's just now it's all in writing. That it is their responsibility as a rigger, and a lift director part of it to make sure that the load, whether it's in sight or out of sight, is always balanced and capable of supporting before it goes over capacity of any. It's that weakest link chain theory. It's only as strong as the weakest link of either sling angles or selection of components together.
All right. Next question. I think this goes back to one that was asked prior. Looks like he's rephrased a bit here. It says, if ironworkers are hired to assemble the tower crane, does one of those ironworkers in the crew become the AD, assembly director?
Yeah, what'll happen is if it's only a crane operator in a tower crane cab working with the crew that's tearing it apart, and that whole crew is an ironworker crew, and you have one operator that's up in a cab to, move any of the components for them, whether it's swinging or cabling. Somebody in that ironworker crew is going to be the assembly disassembly director by nature, by default. It won't be the operator sitting up in the cab where everybody else is driving pins and moving pins. No.
Sure. Okay. Mark asked, and I think we answered this earlier, but where can you get all the new regs and standards? I know you said ASME's website. He also mentions, he writes checklist for JHA A10.42. Is that on the same website?
No. The ANSI A1042 is, you'll have to go to American National Standards Institute website, and then you have to go to, and then you have to search for A10.42, and that'll be the qualifications for riggers. But that'll be in a different location altogether. ASME is the secretary for the ANSI B30s, and ANSI has its own place to go for A1042, which is a completely different committee altogether.
All right. Next question. When using a winch or a hook attachment on a forklift, are you required to have an NCCCO?
If it's determined that it ends up being categorized as a crane, then you are. And that's the exception to the rule, where all cranes are hoist, lowered, and horizontally moved. By broad definition, you become a crane. Everything in that list in the first line was examples of what cranes could be, not inclusive. And basically they said when you use a forklift, you don't have to be certified as a crane operator, but if you configure it to act and look and do what a crane does with a hook and a winch, then you will be.
All right. So the next question talks about, and I would, this makes some sense, with all the standards, training, webinars, etc. How do we get alignment across the industry on this? There's just seems to be so much information out there, and even now we've mentioned all these different standards and places to go. How can we get better alignment in the industry?
You know what? I wish I had the answer to that question, because I've been a training director at the International for years, and we tried to use, just like you guys are, every element of training out there and standards of care and everything. We trained at the B30s, and we had to when CCO started 25 years ago, because CCO started taking language out of the B30 and put it into the testing requirements. So my only I don't know if there's an answer to, where do we get it all to make sure we got it all. I just think that every time we turn around, we find something that we may not be training on or we may not be aware of. And then when we find that, such as these volumes, we need to start including them into our training procedures.
All right. Next question. Can you comment whether or not the ASME B30.5 standard changes you mentioned have any Canadian industry input? Because he writes ASME standards are often referred in various legislation in Canada, for example, material specs and pressure and boiler industries. So basically, is Canadian input going into any of the ASME standards?
Yeah, there's 2 individuals on the B30 committee that are liaisons from Canada. I can't, Sue and Jill, Marriott is the last name of the one. I can't remember the other, but there's 2 individuals that come to every ASME meeting, and they are, they sit in a category of liaison to other countries. We actually have an international category, and there's someone there from Peru. But basically, we do have 2 people that sit from the Canadian side as a liaison to the Canadian government.
All right. Next question looks like it's a 2-parter. When the crane supplier has a tech on site in a crawler crane scenario, does that person serve as the AD director?
So it all depends. There's been challenges between a technical advisor to the assembly, disassembly, and whether that guy fills the need or fits the description of the assembly, disassembly director. And I can't totally answer that question for 2 reasons. One, I don't know legally how it works or either under the government, because the AD director is the individual that guides and understands and challenges the crew. You remember the one part where it says the AD director must inform the crew of all the hazards that exist, and that's where they have that meeting together with their crew. And then there's a technical advisor that sits outside that helps the AD director if needed. And I say that similar to a crane operator who understands the operator manual and runs the crane and should be the technical advisor with the AD director to work in tandem with an assembly, disassembly director who directs the crew. Because in many cases, if it's an operator only, just single operator, and he's in the crane working with the crew that's tearing it apart, moving parts around, he's also coordinating with the assembly, disassembly director and their crew, because it's 2 different companies usually, and he don't have any power or enforcement over what any of the ironworkers are doing to tell him what to do. He does it through the AD director. And I think the technician kind of has the same relationship where he's there to support the AD director and tell him what he should look out for or technically advise him, but he can't tell any of the crew what to do or not to do. That's going to be the assembly, disassembly director of that crew. So I don't know the total answer, but I think that's how it's designed.
All right. Next question. I've heard from multiple sources when using a truck or RT crane, you're supposed to only go up to where the wheels are still in contact or barely off the ground. Is this true, or is it just a common practice?
No, the tires have to be off the ground when you're talking about outrigger support, because the only way to get all the beams supported by the outriggers in the ground is to take all the pressure off of the axles and the tires. Now, some manufacturers may be different. And what I mean by that is outriggers are outriggers that can raise the equipment. Stabilizers are what you might see on small boom trucks. They're different. They stabilize the equipment, but they're not intended to actually raise the full equipment off the ground. And usually they come out like on a 45-degree angle down. They don't stick straight out and then drop down vertically. They usually come out on a 45. And they're called stabilizers more than they are outriggers. So you got to make sure you're not confused with either one.
Okay, another outrigger question. Any rules of thumb to know how many square feet of matting per outrigger per tonnage of crane?
No, there's no, each one's different. And so the ground bearing pressure will always be the same by that crane and the manufacturer. the challenge ends up being is there's no general way to determine if I have a 90 ton, it's this size, and if I have a 150 ton, it's that size. Now, there is an old rule of thumb that exists that Don Dickey put out many, many years ago in the mobile crane manual. And what he said was 3 times the size of the outrigger pad is what you would theoretically use as support under the pad. So if you have a round pad or a square pad, whatever that size is, you would put matting underneath of that is 3 times that size. And that was a general rule of thumb, but it doesn't apply to each and every crane and every single configuration because they're all different.
Okay, yeah, it's interesting. Mike even writes in his question, I didn't read it all, but something he learned 30 years ago about that. So I think there's a lot of different things float around out there. But
Yep.
All right, is there a simple process recommended for employers to do operator evaluations, or does it need to be a third party? And do they need to be evaluated on every crane the employer has?
Yeah, there's no third-party requirement. You can do it in-house. You don't have to evaluate on every single crane as long as cranes are like in kind. So if you have 15 cranes in your fleet and, 5 of them are 50 tonners and 5 of them are 90 tonners and you got a couple different, you would do an evaluation on each type and category of crane, and they would cover the other cranes as long as they're similar. And then the only difference would be if you have some cranes that would allow a completely different configuration on that crane compared to the others, you would want to evaluate them with that configuration to allow them to run all cranes that would have that configuration. But it doesn't say that if you got 30 cranes, you don't have to do 30 evaluations. You just have to make sure that your operators are evaluated to run that type of crane, and he can move between cranes as long as they're very similar. Now, it's objective to what similar means, or it's subjective rather to what similar means, because they can say, I don't believe that to be as similar as the other, but that's as broad as it gets right now.
All right, next question was asked earlier. I'll just reiterate. This PowerPoint presentation will be available on the Impact website along with the video, the whole presentation itself. We're gonna make both of them available if you go to the Impact website, and all of our prior safety webinars are available there. Next question, why does it not specify ground conditions in marshlands?
The challenge with marshlands is that there are no ground conditions. Marshlands are all soft. It's got to be engineered and designed in a big type of a CAD setup. It could be, the padding required for marshes is a monstrous padding compared to just what you would consider to be type A, B, and C soil classifications. There's only 3 types of classifications that are existing in the rule, and that's type A, B, and C. Once you get into marshlands, there is no category. So what would have to happen is an engineering firm would have to determine what would be needed to support a crane in a marsh because it's so soft and just full of silt, and it's just no way to figure that out. That's all.
All right. When instructing a crane class for iron workers, what specific specifications and standards would you recommend to include in the course?
I'd recommend that you go through the OSHA reg for sure that we talked earlier, but pick and choose what things you need for an iron worker, because there's a lot more in that reg that we did not cover. I would recommend you would use the B35 for responsibilities of lift director, site supervisor, rigger, signal people. I think you should also go to what I had on the screen, 9 and 10 for slings and hooks. And then also, I think the other one, I can't remember right now, but it was the other standard that called for rig and hardware. All of them should be included, because in the standard, it calls for the inspection of each component, whether it's a sling, hook, or hardware, rig and hardware. It calls for the use of it. There's a lot of requirements in each of these standards that'll help you in guidance. But the good part is you're at least meeting an ANSI document in training versus someone else's document they might have put together. So I think following the American National Standards Institute volume is probably the best way to train and show that we've done the best part we can do in training.
All right. What certification would be required for forklift with hoisting attachments? TSS, TLL, question mark.
Yeah, it's going to be the smallest. If it's a small hydraulic type forklift, an RT type, then you're going to be probably falling into that small telescopic certification. You won't be in the large because it won't have a swing cab set up, and you definitely won't be into crawler lattice or rubber tire lattice. So it's going to fall into that small telescopic category.
All right, as long as we're on that subject, I'm going to jump ahead a question here. This person asks, if a forklift is considered a cab or a crane, then what NCCO would be required? Swing cab, fixed cab, is there a specific class for this? And another guy asks, what about the 360-degree swinging forklifts, the Manitou type? And I've seen those also now where this forklift actually becomes a crane. And I'm sure you're familiar with the Manitou product.
Yeah, the difference is going to be if the cab is fixed, you would be in the small telescopic, and if the cab rotates with the boom, you would be in the larger telescopic section.
All right. Does 1926.1400 address synthetic hoist lines on cranes?
Not yet. It's brand new into the industry. Some of the manufacturers are putting them on. We haven't seen enough of it, so we don't know what the effect is. I know it's nice because it's easy, it's lightweight, it's durable, it's easy to inspect. We all love it, but I don't think it's as forgiving as what steel cable is when you rub against something. So it's yet to be determined what's going to happen with that.
You think we're going to see more of that in the future?
Yeah, I think that more and more manufacturers will start to put it on their product. It gives them, you got to understand, it gives them a little bit more capacity because a full spool of, so many thousand feet of wire rope cable all adds to the weight. And if you could take that weight out and allow you to pick up something a little bit heavier on the end, you've gained in capacity just by modifying the material that you're using on the crane.
All right. We're down to 2 questions here. The next one is, and you may or may not be able to answer this, but they ask, when will some more of this be coming to Canada regarding the attachment to get a forklift to operate similar for a crane?
Yeah, I have no idea.
Okay.
It's in the U.S. rules, but I don't know what Canada is ever going to do when it comes to changing. All
right. Last question. What is the NCCO cert required for the indoor or spider style cranes and the micro cranes?
So I think they're falling under the small hydraulic cranes because they run them either from an umbilical cord or a standing fixed location. But as long as they hydraulically extend the boom and they're small in nature and the operation is not with a swing cab, they would fall under the small telescoping hydraulic type crane category.
All right. Well, with that, it appears we're out of questions. Bill, I want to thank you for your time, your expertise. This information is invaluable. We had a lot of participants. Again, thank you for your time. And I want to remind everybody it is going to be available on the Impact website. The presentation and the PowerPoint presentation will both be available. And thanks for joining in with us. It's been a great year for this call. I'm excited for next year, the year to come, and I want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a very safe, successful, and happy New Year. With that, we'll be signing off. Thanks again, and Merry Christmas, everybody.
Take care.